Welcome to the Aerospace Advantage podcast, brought to you by PenFed. I'm your host, Heather Lucky Penny. Here on the Aerospace Advantage, we speak with leaders in the DoD, industry, and other subject matter experts to explore the intersection of strategy, operational concepts, technology, and policy when it comes to air and space power. This week, it's time again for the Rendezvous, our monthly look at what's happening in Washington, D.C. when it comes to air and space power, plus important national security trends we should be watching around the globe. And with that, I'd like to welcome our Washington experts, Laser Lazarski and Sledge Harmer.
Lucky, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, great to be back.
And from our space side, Jeff Rollison. Raleigh, great to have you back.
Hey, giddy up. Thanks for having me.
And we've also got Jen Boots Reeves and Doug Berkey here, too, to bring in some key space and air perspectives as well. Boots, Doug, welcome.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks.
Hey, great seeing you guys.
So, Sledge and Laser, we've been reading a lot about the reconciliation on the Hill. First, what is this from a technical perspective, and how is it different from a standard budget bill?
Lucky, those are two great questions and have been a topic of many discussions over the past few months. I'm going to go with the second question first. So, standard budget process. I mean, it's something we all know and maybe not love, hate, whatever. Simple format, but as we all know, very difficult to execute. So it starts with the federal agencies about 12 months ago from an October to create a budget, comes over to the OMB, the White House Office Management Budget by October the year before. OMB reviews it. The president, by law, submits it over to Congress no later than the first Monday in February, but it's often delayed as it is this year. Matter of fact, we just got the skinny budget today, and I know that Sledge's got some additional comments on that. And that's just because new administrations typically take longer to send over the budget because they're modifying what's in there so it reflects the current administration's priorities. So we haven't seen the full budget. What we've seen, the skinny that was just released today to May and includes $1 trillion, $1.0 trillion for national security. And that's something that Chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Chairman Roger Wicker from Mississippi, has been advocating over the past 2 years. And we're still not sure when we're going to see the full budget yet, but we're thinking maybe mid-May, mid to late May. And then Sledge, I know that you're going to get a little deeper, but it's a good increase for the defense budget, around 13%. That's great, but we really do need to see the full budget. And the other concern is what portion of that funding is actually going to be reconciliation funding, which is the second part of this. And then the only other thing is, we've never executed that budget timeline on time, but we haven't done it since 1998, so only 4 times since 1977. That's just a standard budget, and then we'll get a little more on FY26. But reconciliation is separate, and it's an expedited process that Congress uses to pass legislation to mandate spending changes or revenue changes or a debt limit change. And that's why you can have actually 3 reconciliation bills. But it's specifically to make budget changes outside the normal process, which is that first process that we do. So I said we can actually do 3 reconciliation bills a year, but the problem is they take so long to do and they're so difficult that typically, they will only do 1. And the main difference between the normal process and the reconciliation is debate time is limited and passage only requires a simple majority in the House and the Senate. So 51 or 50 votes if you're going to use the vice president to break a tie, and that prevents any type of filibuster, which is delaying or blocking any type of vote by the minority. And it is typically used, and we discussed this before, when one party controls the White House and then has a majority in the House and the Senate. That way they ensure the legislation can pass Congress and then is signed into law. And while this is an expedited process, there are rules that need to be followed, and it really actually has to get followed by both, because even though that the Senate has what we call a bird rule, which says it has to impact the budget, and it also does not allow any extraneous provisions, basically not related to the budget, or if it increased the deficit more than 10 years, or it can impact Social Security. If it doesn't pass any of those, it could cause problems in the Senate. So even though the House right now is working through the reconciliation process and they've marked up 6 of the bills, whenever that package gets done and gets sent over to the Senate, It's going to go through that bird bath, and they don't want any hiccups because that could disrupt the whole bill. So, as I said, they've already marked up 6 of the bills. They started that on the 10th of April, right after they passed the budget resolution. So this week, again, Monday, Tuesday night, or Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday is when they worked on these. They hope to get finished by the end of May in the House. And then the Senate, there's no timeline set, but they have this marker out there of the 4th of July. They're going to try to get it done. And that somewhat ties into what the Treasury, even though they haven't put an X date when we run out of money because we've reached our debt ceiling limit, but that's what they're trying to get this done, because within that reconciliation bill is an increase of about $5 trillion to our debt ceiling limit. So again, we have one normal process this would take you through, and it requires 60 votes in the Senate. And then the reconciliation is just an expedited process, and they're going to hopefully get that done by the end of July before the August recess.
Yeah, I think Laser hit most of everything on reconciliation. The only thing that I would add is the way reconciliation works, both on the spending and the revenue piece of the budget, it covers a 10-year period. But the intent of Congress for any added funds through reconciliation are going to be spent. Their goal is to have, at least for DoD, 40% of the reconciliation funds obligated in the first year, and the remaining 60% of the funds obligated by the end of the second year. So the $150 billion for defense, if that makes it through, that's going to be a very large pig going through the python here in the next 2 years. That's just a heads up for industry as they're looking there. But then Laser mentioned, so the administration released their skinny budget this morning, and that's Friday morning. I know this is going to probably come out in a day or two, but it looks like a lot of money if you do the math, and you've got to be very careful how you parse the numbers out here. And I know Senator Wicker's been very critical of the skinny budget release, or what was published by OMB today. In fact, he said that what we're seeing here, even though the defense spending is over $1 trillion for FY26, it does not. It basically is. It's a shell game that we're not fully funding defense the way we need to.
And why is that?
Well, the big reason is it's kind of a game of counting what money was added via reconciliation into the top line. So if you look at what the base budget for defense for FY26 is, it comes out to about $893 billion, which is flat from what was enacted in FY25. And then when you look at the $150 billion that were added to via reconciliation, that's about a 13% increase. But in reality, the whole idea behind reconciliation was to jumpstart a lot of programs, or provide that extra money to counter China and do the other things that we need to, that we've fallen behind in the years. And the way the administration's budget's coming out is it's really not doing that. So you're going to see a lot of debate going back and forth on the other. The other part is the FY26 budget request assumes a $163 billion cut from non-defense discretionary. So it's going to make it very difficult to get 218 votes in the House and 60 votes in the Senate, because you'll need that for the regular appropriations for FY26 with cuts that significant. So what is going to be released now, what's going to come out here in the next couple weeks for supporting documentation, is certainly not the end of the story. But what it does allow to happen is now Congress, the authorizers and the appropriators, can go through their normal legislative cycle to mark up and start considering the FY26 bill. So I think that's a very important takeaway.
Well, just add on, and there was a note in this budget that said 3 for national security. And so if you look at the border, DHS and DOD, out of the money that got increased for both of those, I think it was 62% for Homeland, they said at least $375 billion was coming out of reconciliation, which when you start looking at how much was added, it was pretty much all the reconciliation. So Sledge is exactly right. And we were already told ahead of time that this was essentially going to be a flat 4 years. And that was to try to keep down both defense and non-defense, but they were going to try to use reconciliation to increase defense spending. But again, as Sledge said, it's essentially flat.
So what do you see in this bill from an air power perspective? Are there top points that we should be tracking?
Yeah, I think we don't have the details of the 26 budget request. So I think, Lucky, to your question, I think what are we seeing in reconciliation in terms of our...
I mean, that's signaling, right?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of broad categories, and this is going to be a collaboration between Congress and the department, because I hate to overuse the word unprecedented, but this is an unusual situation where you see $150 billion being added for the department to work on their priorities. And it's going to be a down payment for a lot of the big ticket items. So the things that I took out of the reconciliation bill, there's a lot of money that's going to be going into the modernization of the industrial base and the ability to produce more, to manufacture. And I think nowhere is that more evident in the weapon stocks. And as everyone knows, readiness has no constituency on Capitol Hill. So when budgets are tight, your sustainment accounts, so your weapon procurement, aircraft maintenance, those are the ones that become the bill payers. So I think this is going to replenish a lot of the stocks. The two that really stood out to me, the $875 million for CCA to get that moving fast. The other was the $1.5 billion for the Air Force Affordable Mass Munition Program. So the Family of Affordable Mass Munitions, the FAM program, and then the Extended Range Attack Missile, ERAM. I think those stood out. There was a lot in air superiority, retaining the F-22 fleet, the F-15E fleet, $3.15 billion for F-15EX. So I think that's Congress and the department saying, we finally got the message. It's time for us to start buying airplanes. Let's hope anyway.
Yeah. Let's hope they get that. Let's hope that message sticks.
Yeah, and actually, let me. So I guess it was $678 million for CCA. It wasn't the higher number. Yeah. A man can dream. And the other two things I wanted to highlight, I was really happy to see the investment in the nuclear modernization of the triad there, but really the $1.5 billion to go into the Sentinel program. Not only are those resources sorely needed, but it demonstrates a commitment on the part of the administration and Congress, because, again, I think this was done collaboratively, that is the bedrock of our national security, and we need to do that. And then $4.5 billion for B-21 production.
Woo!
That the production word there has really caught my eye, so I think that's significantly important. And then the last thing that I took away here, readiness is more than just having shiny objects. And the investment that's going into the INDOPACOM theater, primarily for infrastructure and exercises, I think is a huge deal. So those are the things that stood out for me in terms of air power.
Sledge pretty much covered everything. I thought there was a space portion, and I know all our experts on the podcast have to be excited about everything on there from all the satellites. I mean, Golden Dome is a key piece, and space plays such a key role. Depots was another one. I mean, we talked about infrastructure, but if we can't modernize or keep our depots modernized and start turning our jets around, we're in trouble also. So it was good to see that. And then there was the personnel piece that's always in there because, and as we've always said, it's our personnel, it's our people that keep everything going. I was happy there's a BAH piece in there. And then, of course, there's a sustainment readiness and modernization and some MILCON. So all of that is outstanding. And again, Sledge talked about the restock and the munitions. I mean, that has to get done. And then there was also, again, besides the exercises that we're having in the Pacific, we're also looking at pre-positioning, which is also going to be critical.
It's interesting. You mentioned the Golden Dome and sensors and all that. One of the things that I noticed in the reconciliation was the allocation of funding for AMTI and GMTI from space. And that's definitely, I think, what we need to do for research and development and begin to field those capabilities. But I also hope that it does not signal a weakening commitment towards airborne AMTI and GMTI. We've already seen JSTARS go away, but I really do think that those layers matter.
Yeah, no, they do. I mean, and I know what you're saying. We've had this conversation before, Lucky. You can't do everything from low Earth orbit or from space. Sometimes you've got to have an air breathing capability there as well.
Well, and it's also about redundancy, right? Their biggest concern about the aircraft is they're vulnerable, but then let's go look at our satellites who are also vulnerable. So having that backup capability instead of just relying on one piece, just like a triad, right? You've got to have both out there to be able to get our operations done.
So Raleigh, what does reconciliation mean from the space power side of the equation?
Well, I think if you look at the budget authority tables that accompanied the House release of their reconciliation plan, you see a really strong validation of capability and certainly a need to develop and contribute to our space infrastructure. So there's investments across the board, whether $7 billion for military space-based sensors to everything from non-kinetic capabilities in INDOPACOM for space. They've got national security space launch range infrastructure in there. So this, to me, as I look at this, it really validates the importance and the critical contributions that our warfighters have in the domain and really what it brings to the infrastructure that we're looking at bolstering through the reconciliation effort.
Jen, what are your thoughts you'd like to add to that?
Well, it's pretty basic. The current Space Force budget is slightly less than $30 billion, right? It's the smallest service and it gets the smallest budget. And so I think that any plus up coming from Congress will absolutely be welcomed. The Chief of Space Operations has said that his mandate to him as the service chief in defense planning guidance actually, when costed out, cost twice more than what they've been authorized, right? So it's almost
we need to double the budget for the Space Force.
Exactly. And oh, by the way, he said they can handle it. If they were given that much money, they could spend it too, right? Everything's ready to go. It just needs to be funded. So bottom line, keep it coming. We need our Space Force and what it brings, and they're severely under-resourced to do what they've actually been charged to do.
So, Boots, you said that General Saltzman said that if they get the money, they are ready to spend it. But one of the things that I saw on the space reconciliation was the development of air-moving target indicators and ground-moving target indicators from space. Now, we can certainly invest in the research and development, but are those really ready to go?
I think from what I know, there are joint partnerships happening between the Space Force and the NRO where they are already deeply involved with those activities.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll jump in there.
Please do.
I think, she brought up a good point. These are buckets of money that have yet to find a home, right? So we don't know how the allocation is going to get attributed to the different programs, whether it's Title 10, Title 50, who the program managers are going to be. So these large buckets of money. And so the AMTI designation, that's $2 billion in this reconciliation plan that's going towards that effort. And we don't know how that program is going to be executed, who's going to do it. And I think those are the things that we're all looking for is who's going to be the lead and how is that money going to be appropriated over time. So those are big questions, but I think you hit the nail on the head, right? We're really getting into developing an infrastructure, and it really validates the need to pour more money into our space-based capabilities. And there's a lot of ground-based capabilities in here as well. So I think there's infrastructure commitments in this effort that are really encouraging for our Space Force.
Well, it sounds like there's a little bit of devil in the details regarding exactly how this gets executed and what the architectures and the operational concepts and how all that information flows. But bottom line is, what we've said here at the Mitchell Institute for a long time is that the Space Force is foundational to all of our military operations, and it needs to be more resourced. So this is ultimately good news. So, Boots, staying with the Space Force, we know that they've been quite busy showcasing foundational documents this month. For example, they just released two really significant ones, Space Force Doctrine Document 1 and Space Warfighting, a Framework for Planners. Can you explain what these are and why they're important?
Absolutely. And this is really exciting because our second Chief of Space Operations, General Saltzman, truly is taking the next steps in this new organization, right? I mean, we're approaching 6 years, and he is laying out not just what they are, but how to move forward in the realm of space warfighting. And that's exactly what these two documents do. The first one, the Space Doctrine Document 1, it really is actually a basic overview of the Space Force. It talks about, for example, the 6 Guardian Truths, basics like the statutory role as defined in law of what the Space Force is supposed to do. It gives an overview of the force structure, including like a bit of a primer on the deltas and the squadrons and the detachments. It really is a great place to go if you want to learn more about the organization, the culture, everything that they're trying to create in the Space Force. There are definitions of the core and enterprise functions, along with basic definitions of everything that comprises those functions, right? For example, what does space access mean, or electromagnetic warfare? Go there and you will learn about those core competencies inside the Space Force. And very importantly, how do Space Forces integrate into the Joint Force, and how are they presented? So I think it's a really great document. And one of my very favorite things about it is towards the end, it actually has a terms of reference. So what that does is it creates a common lexicon, not only for Space Force members, but others as well. Anybody who has anything to do with space writ large, particularly national security space, go there and you can actually ensure that you know what you're talking about in terms of the language, the functions, etc. So this is, I mean, it's like a once over the world of the Space Force and how it's employed. That's what I would say about Doctrine Document 1. Now, 3 weeks after that document was released, the CSO released a truly seminal document on space warfighting. In his own words, he said, quote, "The document establishes basic principles for the use of military power in pursuit of space superiority." And that's a big deal, right? Understanding that space superiority is our ability to use space at a time and place of our choosing, while denying our adversary that same comfort, right? And here's the deal. Space superiority is a precondition for overall joint success. It's true. We can't win anything unless we have space superiority when and where we need it. And here's the thing. For years, we have danced around talking about space superiority, space control, counter space, all of these terms that have sort of popped in and out of vogue from various places in the space business, if you will, in the context of the military and military operations. And what this document does is it puts everything in order and in context, which is so lovely. For example, space control is a function comprising counter space operations, both offensive and defensive, that enables space superiority. I mean, it's all there, and really kind of for the first time, so publicly and so sort of declarative to everybody, right? It's available not only for space planners, but for all other joint planners as well. It's a great document. It defines warfighting concepts and it makes their clear use available for all warfighters.
So this sounds like it's a really good primer for anyone, no matter what service you're in, to be able to read, to understand what space brings to the fight and how to integrate space operations into their domains, and vice versa.
Yeah, absolutely. What I would actually say is Space Doctrine Document 1 is the what, and then Space Warfighting, this guide for planners, is the how, right? Excellent. Each of them give a little of the other, but really focused. We have the what, hey, this is what space is all about. And then Space Warfighting, this is how you do it. And it's really excellent. I've been in the business a long time and we've never had anything like this.
Well, and in what space is doing now is so fairly new, really focusing on space as a warfighting domain. So I think that that's a key component, is that they're laying out these foundational principles of the what and the how, and they're making it accessible not only to their own guardians, but to other members across the other services. They understand how they integrate with space.
PenFed checking and savings accounts are here for all your adventures. From...
Do you take this man to be your husband?
I do.
To...
He has your eyes.
He's perfect.
Learn more at penfed.org. Federally insured by NCUA.
So, Raleigh, I'd like to know from this perspective, why does this vision matter from a DC context?
Well, I think it goes back to what we talked about earlier, money, right? You have to be able to organize, train, and equip, and then you've got to resource it. And ultimately, the staff and General Saltzman sets that vision and then petitions to make sure that even within the building, that our budget requests reflect the importance and the true nature of what our new warfighting domain is, right? And one of the 6 truths, the one I really kind of clung to was space is a warfighting domain, not a collection of supporting activities. And so Boots, the warfighting policy document, is the how we're going to do it. We can't do that unless we're resourced to do it. And we've really got to make the commitment to be able to do that. And I think these documents are just foundational of telling the story. I've said in the previous podcast, we need our guardians to be advocates and really be able to tell their story like we do, with the passion and the definitions of what they're getting after. And I think ultimately General Saltzman has put the groundwork together to really make sure that our Space Force has the story to be resourced, and then is defining it in a way that is just incontrovertible, right? So it's a warfighting domain, and we've got to be able to source it to go get after the fight.
So are you seeing this being received well on the Hill? Or are they just so busy right now they haven't gotten there yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think they can walk and chew gum at the same time, but ultimately, this is a long-term story. This will be a fight even within the building to prioritize space warfighting capabilities. And to go back just a bit in our conversation, the biggest commitment in the reconciliation in terms of dollar value per bucket is $7.2 billion going allocated to military space-based sensors. So that is a congressional narrative that is being followed up by Saltzman's narrative. And I think that's really starting to take hold of where we need to put our commitments. So you're starting to see that, but I think it's going to be a long game here.
All right. Well, speaking of the Hill, we've been in testimony season. So Doug, Admiral Paparo, the Pacific Command commander, testified that significant air power gaps are keeping him awake in this part of the world. What are your thoughts on that?
No, and what I really like about this, and thanks for asking this question, is that this is a leader boldly owning the problem statement. We're not going to get solutions out of the Hill unless that they understand the consequences to not having sufficient capacity, capability, and readiness. And so he was pretty aggressive in articulating this. And he broke it down both in terms of combat air forces and then logistics and mobility. So from combat air force perspective, he mentioned the fact that China has approximately 2,100 fighters right now and over 200 bombers, and that they're outproducing us. And he cited that for the J-20, which is generally deemed their fifth generation long-range fighter, they're building 40 to 50 a year. That's obviously very, very significant, especially when you consider that we stopped building the F-22 years ago, and we only had 187 of them. Mm-hmm. We're never going to be able to get more of those, and that's one of the reasons why NGAD was so important, is to continue gaining in that realm and hopefully have a bigger fleet than 187. And then he also talked about the missile challenges, and he talked about that their advanced missiles, frankly, are just longer range than ours. And if you outstick us with that, you got a major, major advantage. And so that kind of straight talk, I think, is hugely important. And it's also very important to highlight the fact that China can largely focus on China. The United States concurrently has to look at homeland defense, has to look at the Pacific, has to look at Europe, has to look at the Middle East and other regions. And so you look at our fighter force number, which is about the same right now as China's, around 2,100, and bombers are around 141. You just divide that by multiple theaters of concurrent demand. You look at nuclear holdback, homeland defense holdback. I mean, you get down to very small numbers very, very fast. And then you look at the fact that how old our aircraft inventories are, and a significant number are down because they're broken, they're in depot, you name it. And so you don't have to work very hard, and you have a fraction of what you thought you had. And I don't think Congress understands that necessarily. They hear, oh, we've got X number of F-35s or B-2s. What's the problem? Well, divide it substantially, and that's what you really have. And good luck keeping it in the fight day after day when they're shooting at you. So glad for the straight talk, like I said. Now, on the mobility side, which is equally important, he laid out a stat that I thought was really, really important. And he said that when he looks at the combat logistics force in total, which is both sea lift and airlift, he's got about 60% of the actual requirement met. That should keep us awake at night, because we are not going to be able to sustain a fight unless we can sustain logistics. And that logistics force is going to be under attack, and it's going to be attrited down. And so we're starting the fight at 60% of what we really need. That's a huge problem.
Yeah, once you begin to factor in attrition, right? Attrition of the mobility, you talk about mission capable rates. We're not building any more airlift right now. And if you go back to the convoys of World War II, I mean, we have to assume that our sea lift would be under attack as well.
No, I mean, C-130, that's all we're building right now. C-17 hasn't been built in over 10 years, which is a huge mistake. We should have kept those going much longer. You know, he talks about, when he thinks about aerial refueling, he thinks about how many million pounds of jet fuel he has to keep in the air at any given time. And he made the point, we can do some of that with commercial augmentation that you're seeing coming out right now, but those folks are not going to go into harm's way. And so they're going to be in a different part of the operating environment. He also talks about the fact that you look at the joint requirement. It's not that Air Force airlift aircraft are just supporting the Air Force. They're there for everybody. And he cites that to move a single Patriot Air Defense Battalion from INDOPACOM to CENTCOM, and this just happened, he said it took 73 C-17 flights. One Patriot Air Defense Battalion, 73 C-17
That's
flights.
That's eye-watering.
Yeah. I mean, you have just over 200 C-17s in the entire United States Air Force. It almost took half the fleet. That's nuts. And so think about what it'll take to flow spare parts, people, air and missile defense assets, you name it. This is a force that is going to be severely under strain, and I'm glad a leader was standing up for it.
Well, you mentioned, for example, the small fleet that we have of F-22, right, 187. You've got China building J-20s at 50 a year, so they already have a significant number, and they are building more. So recently, NGAD got awarded to Boeing for the F-47, and Lockheed chose not to protest that award. And they also announced a new vision for F-35. What are your thoughts on this?
No, thanks for that question. I mean, it's positive that Lockheed didn't protest the F-47. The reality is we need that aircraft as soon as possible. And any delays with the contest and all of that to re-review everything, I got it. It was their option. That's legit. However, we just need this thing, and that can add months, if not a year, onto an award. The other piece that's really important, too, is, frankly, I think it's good for Lockheed to have good relations with the U.S. government right now, and that does have effects. And the reality here is that F-35, what you also asked about, we need as many F-35s as possible yesterday. And I think to keep the relations good with government is crucial on that front. The vision they outlined, I got it. It's positive, but it's very futuristic. They talk about better sensors, better low observability, meaning stealth, enhanced propulsion, which might extend into enhanced range, expanded weapons inventory, stealthy communication capability. These are all great things. And I have no doubt that the F-35 will grow to have those capabilities down line. And there's positive to that aspect too. It engenders more competition within the airpower industrial base. And if it drives Boeing a little harder on F-47 and really delivering, because there's this very capable option over here, this is a good thing. This makes everybody better. And so I think that we've had too little competition in the defense industrial base for too long.
Yeah.
And if Lockheed can up the F-35 game, fantastic, have at it. But there's a really big proviso here. Like I said, we need more F-35s faster. And what's holding it up right now is that the TR-3 Block 4 enhancements, which are very important, have been lagging, obviously. And we need to ensure that both on the Lockheed side, supplier side, and a government side, resources are committed to solving those problems today. We cannot wait for what could be a Block 5 type F-35 or something like that unless we fix this now and get the program tracking now. Like we talked about earlier, units are sunsetting because they do not have enough iron coming off of production lines to backfill jets that are fundamentally structurally exhausted. And we also need the 5th-gen performance attributes. The number we talk about all the time, we only have 28% of the Air Force fighter fleet is stealthy. That's just unacceptable. And so we need to have more F-35s faster. And I just hope that There is a focus not just on what F-35 can be for the future, but a focus on delivering them for today. It is beyond essential. And you saw hesitation in Congress with the reconciliation package. There were F-15EXs in there, and frankly, Boeing's had challenges delivering those in volume and all. And there weren't F-35s. There's a signal in there, and it's tied to frustration on where the program is, and we need to get over that. We need to buy both airplanes right now because the bottom's really falling out capacity-wise. And so, long answer to a short question, but I think it's good long range. But I think near term, we need this jet today.
Well, and the other important piece is you have to solve the TR3 Block 4 issues because that's the foundation that any future variant would be built off of. So we need to remember that you take the first steps first, and that's really getting this jet healthy right now.
Yeah. And I think members of Congress, and I certainly hope the Trump administration and senior members of DOD, they have to understand F-35 is non-negotiable. So is F-47. They're very complementary, but you must have both.
Yes. So, Jen, Space Force is finally launching some capabilities that will provide replacement capacity for the Defense Meteorological Satellite Program, or DMSP. And we know that these satellites, they're super old, but people don't really appreciate how crucial real-time weather data is to all of our combat operations. I mean, if you just think about, for example, JADC2 and being able to knit together real-time kill webs. So you're real-time choosing what your target is. It's on the move. It's not pre-planned. You're trying to pair that with a weapons delivery combo. You need to make sure that that is appropriate for whatever those meteorological conditions are. And if we don't have those weather satellite constellations that are able to see and help inform those choices, I mean, it just becomes unviable. But DMSP is old and fragile. As I said, no form of military power is viable without that kind of weather data. Can you bring us up to speed on this effort?
Absolutely. Okay, so I love what you said because it is true. DMSP has been around for a very long time. Think about this. The first one was launched in 1962, and that was only 5 years into the United States being a spacefaring nation. How crazy. Space-based
57,
weather.
Sputnik, 5 years later.
Space-based weather has been around almost as long as we've been in the space age. So it's really important. And what has happened is, well, there have been 19 of them that have made it to orbit, but apparently, and I wasn't personally involved in this, but apparently there was a whole big long drama and saga about DMSP 20. And so if anybody wants we can talk operational stuff and we can talk history. And one of the historical things is to go read about what happened with DMSP 20. And it caused a huge problem with the Department of Defense, really, and with Congress. And there was a lot of problems getting a replacement weather system back on track. Well, I believe we're there. I believe we're back on track. And the big deal that happened was just last week, the Space Force accepted a new system that was actually launched almost a year ago, but they've been doing exhaustive test and checkout to ensure that it does exactly what it's supposed to do. And it's the first of of a couple new systems, the first of several new satellites that are online. So here's what we have going on. The weather system follow-on microwave, WSFM, that's what happened. So the first one was launched. We just accepted it. Very exciting news, right? The technology is microwave technology. And we're going to expect another one to be launched next year. And presumably that checkout will be a little shorter since this is the second one. So good news there. Then additionally, a whole different set of technology, electro-optical / infrared weather system, so EWS. There was a demo that was launched last year. It was the technology, the sensors that were tested, not the actual the bus of the satellite. Okay. So on a CubeSat, they sent up some sensor demonstrators that checked out very well. And so we expect later this year, the first EWS to be launched. And a couple years from now, 27 is what we're hearing for the second EWS. So it looks like we're at the beginning of the journey to actually repopulate a military space-based weather capability that we absolutely must get after. It's so important that we have access to weather data. We do not go to war without it, right? So we've got to get after it. And finally, it seems like the journey of many years is finally coming to a close with some new operational capability.
Yeah, and not only do we need to launch these satellites, but we need to get them in volume. We need to have a lot of them, right?
Yeah, well, yes. So certainly based on how the orbitology works, you want to have different times of the day where they actually fly over the same place so that you can get your look angles that are consistent every time you're over the same place. And so typically, yes, that takes a handful of satellites, not dozens, but certainly more than one or two. And so they're getting after that.
Yeah, and we do need to have this weather, because it's not just about can you take off, can you land, but ultimately weather impacts a warfighter's ability to deliver kinetic or non-kinetic effects, right? So whether or not, if you've got big storms, you're not going to be able to use an electro-optical targeting, whether or not this endgame guidance, or even if you're just finding and tracking the target. So this weather capability is essential for the real-time JADC2 vision that we have of being able to create dynamic kill webs against moving targets. All right. So, Doug, the Air Force launched a new electronic warfare squadron, which back in the day when I was a young pup, I was the squadron's electronic combat pilot. So this makes me super happy to see this kind of mission growth. Could you share your perspective on why this matters?
Now, what you're talking about is the 23rd Electronic Warfare Squadron, Eglin. April 18th, they stood up. They're part of the 350th Spectrum Warfare Wing. Obviously, friends of the podcast, we've had their leadership on a bunch. I cannot overemphasize how important this is, because what it really represents is growing the intellectual capability and capacity of the Air Force to get back into the electronic warfare, the EMSO, electronic magnetic spectrum operations world. And this is an area where we took major cuts coming out of the Cold War. I think we took way too much risk. And this is ungodly sophisticated talent. Mm-hmm. You do not do this at the flip of a switch. This takes a long time. It's an art, and it is going to be the heart of the fight in so many ways when we talk about what's going to go on in the future. And look at what's going on in Ukraine right now. That is an EW war on steroids, and it's one where it's very fast moving. It's dynamic. What works today might not work tomorrow. It's back and forth all the time. That comes down to intellectual talent. Now, this one squadron that stood up, they're really going to focus on the mission data files for C2 ISR units. Mm-hmm. And you think about what those folks do. This is just very, very encouraging to see. And I applaud the folks at the 350th. I mean, good on them for sustaining this growth curve. It is not easy, and I'm glad to see them manifesting this vision.
No, I totally agree. I mean, like you said, we've had them on the podcast before, and they are total rock stars. And although you hear a lot of folks talk about cognitive EW with this notion that you're going to be able to put artificial intelligence in the forward edge of the battle space and have it magically do all that kind of adaptation, it really does come down to the humans and how they understand and how they interpret and how they're going to adapt, because they are the real power behind any of our algorithms.
Absolutely. And they're force multipliers when you think about how they proliferate their insights throughout the force.
Oh, yeah. And the way that they layer effects to increase survivability and increase lethality within the battle space.
Yep.
So, Boots and Raleigh, the Space Force recently announced they'll be tasking some terrestrial capabilities to boost space domain awareness. Why does this mission matter, and what's the architecture for how the Guardians are going to accomplish this?
Well, something that just got announced that I think is really exciting is SSC's Orbital Watch, right? So remember that the whole reason that we have the Space Force is that the domain is congested and contested, right? So this Orbital Watch tool, it's in an early phase, but it's going to be bringing to bear what was intended with greater collaboration with industry and our commercial partners and providers, right? So this is in direct alignment with the DoD, last year's DoD Commercial Space Integration Strategy and the Space Force's Commercial Space Strategy. And what it's about is disseminating critical threat data to commercial providers so they can actually improve the designs of their systems against modern threats while they're actually building them. So that once they're on orbit, once they're operational, they will actually be optimized to deal with the threat environment that's actually out there. So at this point, it's only these quarterly fact sheets that are coming out on the threat, but the powers that be are saying that they're likely to increase in frequency as the ability to compile more data increases. And also what's happening is our commercial partners in this are contributing what they can for the larger team there, right? And the goal is eventually to have a secure commercial portal for this threat information sharing. So the bigger question is, what's the point of all of this? Well, we intend to further rely on dual use capabilities, as in commercial capabilities that serve a military purpose as well. And our commercial provider should build those capabilities being fully threat informed. Not only does it keep our assets safer on orbit, but then in the larger picture, it shares the cost of and lessens the cost of all of these expensive capabilities that we need. So I think this is a great step forward, and I look forward to how it plays out.
So Raleigh, what's your perspective?
This comes down to commercial delivering capability and augmenting the sort of budgeted resourced efforts that SDA-CP, led by Colonel Brian McLean, are getting after. And I think Colonel McLean said during the Space Symposium this year that he wants to do a little bit of both. And that you're starting to see, whether it's a STRATFI awards for ground mobile radar systems that are commercially based, or some of the JCO-led acquisition of commercial SSA, SDA data. There's a real commitment to augment our ability to find, fix, and track essentially everything that's going on in the domain, in the space domain, and kind of heavily punched on the reconciliation effort. There is even a very deliberate investment for INDOPACOM capabilities specific to DARK, the deep space analysis and radar capability, and Silent Barker in INDOPACOM. And so that has been allocated about $528 million. So I think there's an overarching theme here. Space Command has often said through the last couple of years that SDA, space domain awareness, is its top priority, so they can characterize intent of the domain. And I think both our direct investments and our commercial capabilities are catching up, and we're starting to see a commitment to that.
That's great. I mean, if you don't have the domain awareness, there's nothing you can do to be able to maneuver to affect the space domain. So swapping back to the air domain, Doug, President Trump just announced the F-15EX for Selfridge Air National Guard Base in Michigan. Talk to us about why that's significant.
Okay, this is a really big deal because this is the first time in a long time that we're seeing a reversal on an Air Force that's just in a continual capacity decline. So, for example, in the 25 budget request that President Biden sent over, the Air Force was asking to divest 250 aircraft, but only buy 91. Mm-hmm. That math, and I'm a history major here, is a death spiral. It does not add. No. I mean, and so what was happening is that fundamentally, this has been going on so long, and there is no slack in the system, that units were coming up short, and they were not in a zone to get replacement aircraft. We saw this happen at Kadena, where the F-15Cs and Ds were retired about 3-4 years ago.
With no replacements.
Yeah, nothing. And so units have just been flowing through there to gap that hole in one of the most critical zones in the world. And it's been running people into the ground. And then you think about the Air National Guard, they're the canaries in the coal mine because they have some of the oldest iron in the entire Air Force. And when we're seeing units, especially ones with the A-10, those are being retired pretty aggressively right now. That's where you see groups like Selfridge, Maryland, and others where they didn't have options. There just weren't going to be jets to backfill. And so it was going to see a de facto sunset of the flying portion of the unit. And why does that matter? First off, COCOMs are screaming for air power. And so, those A-10s were still deploying around the world to meet COCOM demand up till the last days they were in service. And so you got to backfill that with something. The COCOMs aren't just making this up. I mean, Iran's pretty dangerous. Russia's still fighting in Ukraine. China's a big deal in the Pacific. You do not want to create a gap. Additionally, the people are probably the most concerning things. We all know about the chronic fighter pilot shortfall, 2,000 pilots. Why would we be driving out pilots that are in the system, fully trained? But that's what it does. Maintainers, I mean, you think about the national aviation maintenance shortfall writ large, civilian and military right now, we would have kicked those people to the curb. It takes years and years and years to generate that talent. Not just somebody with a certificate out of a school, but seasoned talent that you can trust. And so backfilling that unit itself, Rich, is so important because it represents slowing, because it's still set to happen in some units, this decline, and bringing some new iron in. And that was thanks to the reconciliation legislation that we talked about at the top of the episode here, but that's why those additive tails are so crucial. And this time it was with F-15EX at Mitchell. We are huge fans of also boosting F-35 buys because we need that fifth-gen capacity. We need to increase the stealthy presence in the Air Force. And right now, like I said earlier, it's 28% of the force. We need more of it. But awesome news there. I hope there's a fix for the other affected units on the way. But for President Trump to be there, I think it's really important. And there's another key part of this, and that is this largely happened due to the political influence of the governors. Governor Whitmer laid down some serious capital to make this happen. We are beyond the point of the Air Force thinking it can solve all this on its own. They have got to partner with the governors. And oftentimes we hear resistance that, well, I can't access this guard iron and all that. Well, how much can you access the jet that you never bought? I really would like to know what the ute rate is on the 198th F-22. Guess what? It's 0 because we never bought it. So there's a point where we just need to buy the aircraft any way we can. And if it comes through the Guard and through their political alliances, fantastic, because when the balloon goes up, they all go.
And I think it's important also to recognize that the EXs were done through reconciliation, so it was additive. It was not taking anything away from the active duty.
Yeah.
And this goes more towards understanding that we need to have leadership within the military that says we need more. We've heard General Alvin say we need more Air Force. We also need them to say, hey, we need to have the resources to buy more fighters for the very reasons that you said. Now, I know that Boeing just won F-47. I hope they keep the EX line open and they boost that production rate because right now we need as many fighters in production as possible. Boost as much F-35 as possible, boost as much F-15EX as possible because small fleets, take a look at the F-22, really are not as useful as there's no such thing as a silver bullet for small fleets. That you just can't keep them alive.
They're also too costly because you don't amortize the overhead.
Yeah, you don't amortize the overhead, test, training. There's so many reasons why small fleets don't work. So we know the Nean curve is about 250. That should be the target.
Yep, for sure.
So the House Armed Services Committee also just held a hearing on small drone defense. We've heard from a lot of folks on this one. What insights can you provide us, Doug?
This is an interesting one. There is a school of thought right now in many ways that is saying we're at the end of history and air superiority doesn't matter anymore and we can just get rid of these fighter planes because it's all going to be done with small drones. Just look at Ukraine and what's going on in the Red Sea, and that just tells you that the day of the fighter plane is done. That's insane. The reality is it's not about or, it's about and. Controlling a domain, whether it's air, sea, space, underwater, land, you name it, that is absolutely fundamental. And so this is all about continuing the traditional air superiority missions that we've been doing forever, while also recognizing that small UAVs are opening up a new lane of challenges and opportunities. From a challenge perspective, what you're doing is giving individuals at a very tactical level the ability to use these assets as very precision-guided munitions. And so you think about bases in Iraq and Afghanistan, they're subjected to mortar attack pretty regularly, but the probability of actually hitting something wasn't very high. It was just kind of fired over the line and see what happened. With UAV, they can drive it directly into what they want, whether it be a aircraft parked in a line, a chow hall, you name it, because they're normally connected to a sensor.
Well, and also it also provides those individuals, whether or not it's as a soldier in infantry or so forth, to have their own dedicated organic ISR,
Yep.
right? We take a look at the 64 orbits that Secretary Gates wanted in Iraq and Afghanistan is because you had small army units wanting to be able to see around the corner. They want to be able to see over the next hill.
Yep.
And that was not cost effective. The burden of operations to be able to provide that kind of ISR it was incredibly difficult. So these small drones also provide that kind of advantage and opportunity.
Yeah, and it's really expanding the notion of what it means to have a reconnaissance strike complex at one of the most tactical levels on the planet. And I also think we should expect to see this extend to forms of electronic warfare, just straight up ISR, you name it. It's going to have massive homeland defense implications, as we saw that incursion over Langley over a year ago. That was pretty terrifying. There are things in power projection that we're going to have to deal with. It's also opportunities for us, so we need to think about how to harness this. So I'm glad to see that the committee was actually looking at this. And again, I'm glad to see that they're adopting the tone of and, not or. And that does need to reflect on resourcing, because right now you're seeing the services kind of say, hey, not my thing. They're saying it because they don't have the cash. And so this is something where we really need to properly resource. And I think one of the most important things is roles and missions and command and control. Because if you think about it, okay, great. If you're on a ship out at the Red Sea defending against Houthi drones, yeah, got it. You can kind of do what you want. You don't have to deconflict with much. However, if you are doing base defense in an area that overlaps other installations, other services, other allies, it could be a real mess. And you could have fratricide. You could be jamming each other, just be a total mess. So how do we come up with a way where there are appropriate roles and missions in C2 to ensure that we have unity of effort, effective, efficient operations? That's probably not going to be everybody gets their own toy and does what they want with it. There's got to be a plan. We got to move that out pretty fast.
But there also has to be organized command and control, as you mentioned, because it's not just about what's happening on the ground. There's also airspace deconfliction. There's also integration of operations. And when you talk about counter operations like counter UAS, we need to make sure that we're not jamming our own forces, depending on whatever those countermeasures for small drones against red drones might be. And as you mentioned, we need to make sure that our blue drones, the ones that we're using, are not also working against us, whether or not that's land on land, land to sea, land to air, and vice versa.
Exactly.
Because we can't, you mentioned this notion about Ukraine, we cannot learn the wrong lessons from Ukraine. And I think a lot of folks are doing that because it's interesting, it's cute, and it's hot.
Always remember the people that came out of World War I had this moral imperative never to fight that kind of attrition fight again. That's why they're so dedicated to strategic air power. For us to actually think that we would want to embrace a Ukraine-style fight is beyond insane. And guess what? In a fight versus China, we are Ukraine. We're the smaller one, and we would bleed out against China given their mass. And so we should not be rushing to adopt desperation tactics that the Ukrainians had to revert to. We should instead think about how we approach the and of the equation and be smart. We cannot ignore this challenge, and we cannot ignore the opportunities it presents, but we got to be really smart and move forward and not throw away advantages like air superiority that are fundamental.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you being here. It's been a great conversation, and we'll see you next month on the Rendezvous.
Thanks. You take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for having me. It was super fun.
Great to be back.
Thanks a lot, Lucky.
With that, I'd like to extend a big thank you to our guests for joining in today's discussion. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to you, our listeners, for your continued support and for tuning into today's show. If you like what you heard today, don't forget to hit that like button and follow or subscribe to the Aerospace Advantage. You can also leave a comment to let us know what you think about our show or areas you would like us to explore further. As always, you can join in on the conversation by following the Mitchell Institute on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn, and you can always find us at mitchellaerospacepower.org. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great aerospace power kind of day. See you next time.